Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On Art. On Art is my podcast where I talk about everything related to art, mostly through the spectrum of music. I'm back today with a new quick episode, and on this episode, I want to talk about something from this. Um, this is one third. This is a book I released for my 33rd birthday. This was 2 years ago. And it's a book where I essentially reflect on a third of life lived, and I look at lessons and observations and meditations, and giving out a few advice to myself and to the reader. It's called One Third. I hope I'll be living long enough to write 2/3 and 3/3. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is the last chapter on that book. There's 20 chapters, and the first chapter starts with "Silence does not exist." I think that's an interesting topic, and it leads up to something that's called a chapter that's called "Enjoy the Process." And I want to talk about this because I think there's a very interesting thing to look at. And the reason why, the thing that triggered me to talk about this today is Giorgio Armani died yesterday or the day before. So obviously, social media is flooded with pictures from him and tributes and that sort of things, and obviously quotes from him as well. And there's a quote where he says that essentially, I think if I remember well, 80% of his work or of his success is discipline, and the rest is creativity. And I thought it was quite interesting for two reasons. First of all, um, there's a case of us artists nowadays being um, dominated by everything but art and spending most of our time doing everything but art. And there's also a case in the fact that, and this is going to be a bit more philosophical, most art, at least in my views, is done in the head before it gets created. And I think us as artists, the creative moment is very short, but it's part of a long process that involves deep thoughts, reflection, um, influences, gathering influences, educating ourselves, developing ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about this today, very briefly, and I want to talk about particularly the process. In one third, I talk about the process from a life perspective, and this one is a bit more broader, but of course, it applies to any artistic endeavor, and it applies particularly to music. Um, and that is the case of for the creator, for the composer, um, particularly for the improviser, but I'll focus mostly on the composer. Um, it feels that the most exciting part of the job, if I can say, is really the creation process. Um, Many artists, many musicians have often been heard saying that they do not listen back to their own works. They don't listen back to their albums. And if they do, they listen to this with a lot of distance, many, many, many years after they've been released to the world. That doesn't apply to me for two reasons. The first one is I think it's very important to listen back to myself because I want to understand my music better and I want to understand myself better. I want to see my evolution. I want to see my artistic oeuvre. That's something I've mentioned in the past podcast. And I want to avoid repeating myself as well. So I do listen back to my works very frequently on a weekly basis. But I also listen to them in a context which is the context of my label, and that's the second reason why I listen back to the works, because I listen back to the music of the label um, for two reasons as well. First one is because I enjoy the music. Everything that I release on No Aux is music that I enjoy listening to, so I like to listen to it frequently, and also because I want to understand No Aux better. And obviously, my catalog is part of the No Aux catalog, so that leads me to listening to my works very often. So on that point, I'll say I disagree with most artists. I think it's important to listen back to yourself and to understand yourself better. But that's a side note. Now, when it comes to the process itself, yes, there is an important case on this. Regardless of the the length of that process, of the difficulty of that process, for me, this is the heart of being an artist, being a composer. For me, the reason why I create music is for that moment where the music comes out of your head, out of your heart, out of your mind, and goes on paper or on a software, because nowadays that's a lot of the mediums we use to create music, or obviously on an instrument. And very often we tend to sort of forget, particularly as composers, as musicians, that this is really what matters to us as creators. And there is a case in saying that does it really matter if the music is successful afterwards, and successful from an opinion standpoint, from a commercial standpoint? There is a case to this, to say, well, what are you doing this for? Why are you creating music? Is it for the result, the end result? Is it for the success of that result? Or is it for this process? And I think if the answer is the former, then there's a bit of a reflection piece to have. If the answer is the latter, then you're in good shape. There's a Japanese photographer as well who used to say this. If you do remember who he is, please share his name in the comments. I could try to find this and put this in the comments myself when I release that podcast. Essentially, what he says is that all that matters to him is to take pictures. All that matters to him is photography, is the process of creating that moment, stopping that moment in time and creating that picture of it. And all that matters is this, and that through our life, we must, as creators, devote ourselves to this creation process. And that's it. And that's our success. This is where our success as creators and as artists lies, in being able to achieve the creation of something, and being able to go through that process of creating something. Whatever happens once the work is released to the world doesn't belong to us anymore, in a way. And that's quite an interesting view as well. A piece of music is a creation of, obviously, its composer. What it becomes is not in the hands of the composer anymore. It's in the hands of the listener. What the listener hears in that piece of music is not in control of its creator. That's an interesting thing as well, to accept, to let your work, your imagination, your thoughts, your intentions belong to someone else, and belong to the listener rather than to yourself. Whatever you feel, whatever intentions you had when you created a piece of work is subject to interpretation. And whether you like it or not, this interpretation will always be different from your own intention in the first place. So the bottom line is, once again, the process wins. Once again, the process is the only moment where the creator, the artist, the composer, has control over the work. What's also interesting in the process topic is that there is the process of creation, and this is that moment where the work takes shape, or actually that moment where the shape is finalized. But the creation process is, and this is what I've mentioned a little bit when I started the video, the creation process is not a sort of one-step activity. It's actually the result of a sort of a chain relationship, and it really starts with the education part, and it's a little bit the same. It's whether we want it or not, we're constantly, as artists, being educated by the world, right? Every single book that we read, article that we read, exhibition that we see, film, music we listen to, interaction that we have, observation that we have, just sitting in a car, watching through the window, all this is part of the education process of the artist. And consciously or not, there is studying a painting, studying a score, studying a work of art, a book, and then there is this unconscious sort of education. And that's really the beginning of the process. And what's interesting with this as well is that this education part happens constantly, but we sort of tend to realize it with various lengths, and some things sort of emerge out of our mind many years after they've entered our mind. So I think that's, for me, that's the first part of the process. The second part is what I call that conscious sort of boiling of the creative stew, if you want. And what I mean by this is constantly working on the muses, constantly working on the creative part of our brain, so that we're constantly creating whether we want it or not. And I have a very strong, and perhaps I should talk about this next time, I have a very strong opinion on what people call the blank page. I think it doesn't exist. It's lack of discipline. Because inspiration is something that we nurture, creativity is something that we nurture, and we nurture it through creating constantly. In more modern words, it's essentially a muscle. And that muscle, if it's constantly under stress and constantly under some sort of activity, will maintain its shape, will maintain its strength, right? Creative brain is very similar to this. So if we keep creating constantly, whether it's for a short amount of time or for lengthy sessions, then creativity never leaves our body. But that's really the second part, right? It's the moment where the process enters our minds. We've been influenced by external elements. There's a trigger that gets turned on, and the creation, the tangible creation process starts, right? But this is what I call being deep in thoughts. And I think, when John Lennon talks about being a dreamer, that's a little bit what he's saying, is that artists are constantly dreaming. They're not dreaming about, things. They're dreaming about their art. They're sort of projecting their art. They're sort of thinking about what it takes to get where they're trying to get, and they're thinking about the process, and they're thinking about the elements that constitute that process. And this is, John Cage talks about being deep in thoughts, and I think that's one of the best way to exemplify this. It's that moment where the entire blocks, if you want, a little bit like a Tetris game, they all fall in place. And then there's a very short moment, and this is what people call the creation process, which I think is only a part of it. And this is the moment where the music for the composer is released from the mind, from the head, from the thoughts, put on paper, put on a computer, straight to a microphone, a recording tape, whatever the medium is. And from that moment, of course, there's an entire secondary process of sort of clearing out the structure and putting this in place properly and correcting and spending some time to reflect on it. And all this is what I would say the most obvious process that we are well aware of. And then obviously the work is released to the world, and this is where it stopped belonging to us. But yeah, this process that we think of being the creative process is only, if you want, chapter 3 of the real creation process. And I think that once we pay attention to this, once we realize that this exists in this form, then there's a sort of enjoyment that comes from it, because being an artist is something that takes all of our time, and it's not, art is not a day job, right? It's not something where we clock in and out, but we must realize that process. We must realize that this process is constantly happening, even when we're asleep. It's working on our brain. And I think it's important to enjoy it, it's important to acknowledge it, and it's important to realize that this is the reason why we're doing what we're doing. This is the reason why we're creating art. And anything that happens afterwards doesn't matter. Commercial success doesn't matter. History has proven us many times that the greatest artists, the greatest works of art needed time to be understood the right way. And there's no fighting to it. So yeah, it's part of that book. I thought it was interesting to talk about it because I never really talked about that book, and there's some interesting things in there. I think, even though I read them now with 2 years um, sort of distance from it, and I think I would have written things differently. But I think it's interesting to sort of relate to this book from an artistic standpoint, because this is really how I've written it. Although I've generalized it because I didn't want it to be an artist book. But that process thing comes back in and out a couple of times. I talk about the way life evolves in spirals as well, and it's also part of that process. So yeah, there's a few interesting things in my opinion to look at in that book, and I really specifically wanted to talk about this. So yeah, enjoy the process. I hope you've enjoyed watching that video and hearing me talk about this. Once again, that podcast is available on Instagram in a video format, where you can see me in my living room / studio. It's also available on Spotify. It's available on YouTube. And of course, all your support for in that podcast and for everything that you're doing towards helping me reach out as many people as possible is always very much appreciated. So thank you for this. On a side note, we're now entering Q4, and I wanted to mention as well the label No Ox is working on many releases, including our compilation to celebrate our 10 years. So I want to use those last few minutes of the video also to self-promote the label and our artists. We have many things coming out. Artists that are new to the label, some of them that have released with us already, and in that compilation that we're going to release later in October, we've gathered 22, I think, artists that have worked with us over the past 10 years, essentially, and they've created exclusive pieces just for this compilation, and I'm going to send this for distribution in the next couple of days, and it's really exciting. But on top of that, we've got many other artists joining us, new artists, recurring artists. Anyway, it's going to be very exciting, so stay tuned for this too, and catch up with our past videos on art. Lots of interesting topics being discussed between myself and myself. But yeah, I hope you're enjoying those sessions. I hope you're enjoying those little quick 15-20 minutes videos. Do leave your thoughts and comments, and I'll see you next time.